in meeting political candidates. We've had a number of candidates here, and we're delighted that you're joining us. My husband, Tom Sylvia, also your host. And so I know I saw Nancy Murphy. Representative Murphy is here. And are there any other reps? There's Rep McGee and Representative Paul Dargy and
it's Ivy Van.
Ivy Van is here as well, and anyone else that... Okay, the reason I am introducing those folks is because this is New Hampshire, and your government in New Hampshire is extremely accessible. So while we all want to meet our our presidential candidates and the people who will be leading this country in the future, it's also super important that you know who your local reps are, because they are making decisions every day for you. So I am asking you to reach out not just to the presidential candidates, but also to your local reps, your senators, your town councilors, your board of selectmen. All of these folks matter, and I'm really glad to see such a group of engaged people here this morning. Now, we are very, very fortunate that Beto O'Rourke is joining us this morning. I think it's a great opportunity for all of us to hear from him, and I also think it's a super opportunity for Beto to hear from all of us about what our New Hampshire priorities are, because I think that a lot of our New Hampshire priorities are the kinds of issues that our people across the country want to see addressed. So, without further ado, I would like you to join me in welcoming Beto O'Rourke.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Buenos dias.
Buenos dias.
That's perfect. Good to be with you all. Senator Chanley, thank you for hosting us. Tom, to you and Shannon for opening up your home. The other representatives and elected officials for taking some time out of your very busy day to be with your constituents, but also to make sure that someone who wants to represent and serve you in the highest position of public trust has a chance to hear from you and answer your questions. The kind of direct accountability and responsibility that Shannon was just talking about is the cornerstone of our democracy, and I think is fundamental to any successful campaign. I was asking Soham how Shannon was able to win this Senate seat in a district that maybe some people thought was a Republican district or a red district. And he talked about the fact that she was willing to knock on doors and just to listen to those whom she wanted to represent and serve. And I remember doing the same thing when I first ran for Congress in 2012. We were running against the odds and against an incumbent who had served 8 terms, who was going to outspend us in that race 5-1. But every single day, for a full-time job, I was knocking on doors and listening to people. And what I learned became the campaign. It was reflected in what I said in the next door I knocked on. And I'll give you an example. And Stephanie and I have talked about this. Stephanie, who's been an extraordinary leader on veterans issues. I'm knocking on this door in January of 2012. And this gentleman answers, and I give my spiel. I'm Beto O'Rourke, and I want to represent you in the United States Congress. Here's some of the great things I want to do. And he says, look, if you want to help me, you're going to fix the VA. And I said, well, what are you talking about? And he said, I just got off the phone trying to schedule a mental health care appointment for the PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, that I've carried with me for 50 years since I came back from serving this country in Vietnam. And they told me to call back next year. They didn't have any appointments open for the remaining 12 months of 2012. Well, of course, I thought this guy is trying to make a point. He's an ornery veteran. He's angry at the system. I knock on the next door and the following door, and either the veteran or the family member of the veteran tells me a very similar story. Essentially, care delayed had become care denied, and we later learned that El Paso, Texas had the longest wait times to see a mental health care provider for a veteran in the United States of America. There are 141 mental health care centers in the VA. We ranked 141st. Not unconnected to the fact that far too many veterans were succumbing from those conditions that they incurred while serving this country. We know that conservatively, the VA estimates that we lose 20 veterans a day, every single day, by their own hand. The majority of those unable or unwilling, perhaps because of the lines, to go into that VA and see a provider, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a therapist who could literally save their lives. And it doesn't take into account those veterans who succumb to opioid abuse and addiction and overdose as well. So we got to work reflecting that on the campaign trail, winning in a 5-person primary without a runoff, and then asking to be on the Veterans Affairs Committee so that we could get this done for those who are counting on us in this position of public trust. We turned around the VA in El Paso. I hired myself on as the chief recruiter for the VA. If you're a psychologist or a psychiatrist practicing anywhere in the United States, watch out. I was going to give you a phone call and talk to you about moving to El Paso, Texas, and tell you that you could make a world of difference for those who put their lives on the line for this country, who'd borne the battle for the rest of us. We wanted to be the center of innovation for the VA going forward. And we did that. We were able to turn that around and improve upon the national average in wait times. We took what we learned and we applied it nationally. And I was a member of the minority for every single day of the 6 years that I served. But we found the common ground to pursue the common cause with Republican colleagues and vastly expand mental health care access for veterans across the country. We're not done yet. There's a lot more work to do, but it's an example of what Shannon was talking about at the beginning of this meeting. That when we talk to, and more importantly, listen to one another, and there's no stopping us in what we're able to accomplish as a country. By and large, the way that we ran that campaign for Congress in El Paso, the way that we ran across the 254 counties of Texas, a few more than you have in New Hampshire, but who's counting? Not writing anybody off, not taking anyone for granted, bringing everyone in, saying, no me importa, I do not care who you voted for president last time, who you pray to, who you love, how many generations you can count yourself an American, or whether you just got here yesterday. Before we are anything else, we are Americans first. And that's what I found all across New Hampshire. This is our 4th visit, my first time here in Amherst, and I've got to tell you, this day has been one of the most beautiful that I've ever experienced on this planet. What you all have done with the weather is...
It's like this every day.
So, we started the day at the Holiday Inn in Merrimack and went for a run. I went with Rob, ran about 3 miles. And we came to this dead end on this road that we were running down, and there was this beautiful bucolic scene. We kind of walk into this forest. There's a bubbling creek. There's birds chirping all around us. There are these mosquitoes. The sound So we got after it, got back, cleaned up, and then drove here about a 30-minute drive. And again, just extraordinary, just so beautiful. Felt so lucky to be alive and to be here right now. And I'll tell you this in conclusion, and I want to listen to you. We got here last night and went to Peterborough for one of these Lights for Liberty events. I don't know if anyone participated in here in Amherst or elsewhere in New Hampshire. These are folks who came out to stand up for children who are in detention, kids who are frightened out of their minds, if we can imagine what they're feeling right now. You have traveled 2,000 miles. You have left your home country, your hometown, your family, everything that you know, to become a stranger in a strange land, to be in a cinder block cell, sleeping on a concrete floor under an aluminum blanket, overcrowded, not knowing the other kids who you are with, maybe sick. We hear about scabies and chicken pox and the flu and other things that these kids are suffering from. But even worse, I imagine, is the mental torture, the emotional deprivation of not knowing when or if you're going to see your parents, not knowing what the laws are in this country, not knowing where you are going to be next. We know that there are thousands of kids in the Border Patrol station in Clint, Texas, in Homestead, Florida, at Southwest Key in Houston. Someone told me there's a detention center here in New Hampshire. I don't know if it's kids or if it's adult immigrants or asylum seekers, but this is the largest mass incarceration of children who've committed no crime in the history of the United States, with perhaps the exception of the imprisonment of Japanese Americans in the 1940s during World War II, imprisoning people simply based on their ethnicity, no other reason. And I think we all can acknowledge that this perhaps naturally follows when you describe, the president describes Mexicans as rapists and criminals, talks about asylum seekers as animals, that's a word he used, or an infestation, which is how you might describe a cockroach or termites or something less than human. What you might have expected to hear in the Third Reich to describe people who some think are unfit to live in your country. That's what the President of the United States is saying in this day and age, in this what is supposed to be the greatest democracy on the face of the planet, a country that is comprised of people the world over, from every walk of life, every tradition of faith, have somehow found a home here and made us the greatest place on the planet by their very presence. That is what is happening right now in this country. But what struck me last night in Peterborough was here were 150 people who themselves were 2,000 miles from the border, who could somehow see themselves in those kids or in those kids' parents, and wanted to make sure that they stood up to be counted at a moment that counts more than any other that I can think of in my life or maybe in the history of this country. Our ability to see ourselves in other Americans is the only opportunity we have to get this country back on the right track. Now that's fundamental to our ability to rewrite our immigration laws so that we free these kids, reunite them with their families, make sure that we never imprison or criminally prosecute somebody for doing what any human would do in the first place. It's fundamental to addressing those challenges for veterans who come back to this country so often to a place that does not understand or recognize or care for them after they have served us. It's fundamental to meeting the opioid crisis or the epidemic of gun violence in this country. It's fundamental to understanding that there are some of our fellow Americans who are working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet and don't have the luxury to read to their kids before the first day of kindergarten. Those same kids already 10 months back in reading comprehension at the starting line of the rest of their lives. Fundamental to understanding that in the wealthiest country on the face of the planet, there are tens of millions who cannot see a doctor or go to a therapist or afford their prescriptions. Our ability to see ourselves in one another is our opportunity to live to our full potential and to fulfill this country's promise. So with that in mind, I'm looking very much forward to hearing what's on your mind, hearing your stories, and making sure that we reflect them back on the campaign trail and share them with the rest of America. Thank you all for having us out.
What did you do day one to fix this crisis?
The crisis on the border
Yes.
or the crisis
No,
that is
but-
America? Yeah.
What would you do to fix it?
Yeah. So the question is, day one, what do you do to fix the crisis on the border? We release every family that is detained right now. We use a family case management program to ensure that, one, they're okay. Now, remember, they're fleeing the deadliest places on the planet. Ask yourself, what would cause you to move 2,000 miles on foot, on a bus, atop a train known as the Beast? You'd only do it if that were the only option you had to save your kids. So let's make sure these folks are okay. Reunite every single family that has been separated. Close down the for-profit detention centers. For that matter, close down the for-profit prisons in this country. Beyond that, free every single dreamer, nearly 1 million in this country, from any fear of deportation by giving them permanent protection and then working with Congress to ensure that they are U.S. citizens in this country. Immediately begin working with the people in, as well as the governments of, Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador. When we invest in violence reduction, when we acknowledge the fact that in Guatemala, they are facing the greatest drought they have ever seen, a drought caused not by God, nor by Mother Nature, but by all of us, this changing climate, a result of our emissions, our excesses, our inaction, in the face of the facts. We've got to be there to help them and understand our own culpability in the problems that these people are trying to flee. And then I think we need to work with Congress to rewrite our immigration laws in our own image. There are millions of our fellow Americans who are working the hardest jobs under the sun, if lucky making a minimum wage. Far too often their immigration status used as leverage against them to pay something less if they get paid at all. A modern day bondage in this country right now. Let them come forward, register with the government, contribute even more to this country's success. Those are all things we can begin day one of this administration, but most importantly, treat these kids with the humanity that they deserve, make sure that they are taken care of. Thanks for asking.
First of all, thank you. In reference to these deplorable conditions, in addition to voting you into office, which is a box checked as far as I'm concerned, what can we do now, the citizens, the people on the ground, to help the situation?
It's why what we saw in Peterborough and across the country in the Lights for Liberty protests was so encouraging to me. More than a year ago, Father's Day of 2018, we had learned that President Trump had begun a zero-tolerance policy, meaning that 100% of families apprehended in between ports of entry were separated. The kid placed in a cage, the mom turned over to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution, then to Immigration and Customs Enforcement for deportation back to the very country from which she fled. That child then turned over to Health and Human Services, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, a tent in the desert in a community called Tornillo, just outside of El Paso, Texas. We learned about it. We sent the signal out. Within 24 hours, 1,000 people descended on Tornillo, Texas, to bear witness and testify back to their fellow Americans about what was being done in their name. Within months, that zero-tolerance policy had ended, and a few months more, Tornillo had completely closed down. In this democracy, when we understand that though this was a decision of one man, the responsibility to change it is on all of us, and we don't have to wait just until the next election. We can take action now. We actually produce the change that we want to see. It is painstakingly slow, it is frustrating, but that's the way that any significant change in this country has ever happened. We just celebrated the 55th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, and though President Kennedy introduced it and President Johnson was the one who signed it, and we're grateful for the members of Congress who voted for it, they were really responding to the public pressure. Those images from the campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, those teenagers pinned up against a wall, fire hoses that could peel bark off of a tree used on human beings, that shocked the conscience of the country and forced the political action. That's what I think is happening right now, and that's why I'm optimistic and encouraged. So you ask what you can do, please keep that up. Continue to bear witness and testify to your fellow Americans.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sounds good.
Yes, ma'am.
Hola.
Hola.
It's my limit of my Spanish.
To use it.
Change topics here a little bit.
Yeah.
If you became president and you had the opportunity to nominate a Supreme Court justice, what type of individual are you looking for to serve on that court?
A good person. Someone that we can be proud of, who exhibits the temperament and the character that speaks to this country at its very best. In addition, I would want to know that they understand that the 1973 decision, Roe versus Wade, is the established and settled law of the land.
Yep.
We want to make sure that they fully understand that right now that there really does seem to be a contest between people, natural-born human beings, citizens, and corporations. And after the 2010 decision, Citizens United, which essentially said, and I'm not an attorney, so this is boiled down for a way that I can comprehend, corporations are people, and money is speech, and therefore corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money to purchase not just access and influence, but outcomes in our legislation, in our democracy, and in elections. That is the way that you can explain the otherwise inexplicable. The highest drug prices on the planet from the very country whose taxpayers devised those cures in the first place, or the reason that we have not fully met our end of the obligation for veterans, or the fact that nothing seems to track in Congress with what our priorities are in the urgency that we feel here right now. So a Supreme Court justice who will side with human beings and citizens over corporations. And then from my perspective, in Texas, where you can still be fired based on your sexual orientation. From my perspective, in Texas, where there were 30,000 kids in the foster care system and child protective services so badly underfunded that kids were sleeping on top of and underneath the desks. In my home state of Texas, you can still be too gay by law to adopt one of those kids into your loving and caring home. So a Supreme Court justice who believes and will rule upon the full civil rights of every single American, whoever we nominate and is confirmed, will make decisions that will affect not just this generation, but generations that follow well into the next century. So I want to make sure that at least on those three core issues and many others that we see eye to eye, and that we have somebody that we can be proud of. So the question is, do you support judges serving for life or having some kind of term limit? I support term limits at every level of government, from the mayor of El Paso, President of the United States, to members of Congress. I think if we believe in one another and believe in this democracy, then we believe that there's somebody who can succeed any one of us and do just as good, if not a better job. Our proposal for the Supreme Court is that justices would serve for a term not to exceed 18 years and then would cycle down to another federal bench. I think that would reduce some of the pressure and the temperature on these nomination battles, and a little bit more consistency and the ability to expect when there will be turnover on that court. So that's our proposal for this.
Great.
Yeah, yes ma'am.
Yes, hi. I think being involved in local politics here in the state, I've noticed that some of the ground has shifted in terms of how we operate together, and I guess the best way to explain it or ask you a question about it is to say, it seems like we're not dealing with honest brokers. If you're both honest brokers but you have differing opinions or differing views or positions, it's really easy to, well, it's not easy, but it's easier to come to decisions that can actually solve some of the major problems that we have. But at this point, we don't really have honest brokers in many cases, and it may be the money, there's a lot of things affecting our politics. But I guess what I would ask you is, how do you hold to account an administration that's okay with rigging everything and that is pushing us further than ever away from the idea of two-party honest brokers trying to come to a solution? I mean, it seems like it's a major issue for our politics, but we don't hear a lot of people talking about it.
Right.
It's a really good question and a tough one.
Well, you must have thought about it. So.
So I mentioned earlier introducing legislation to expand mental health care access for veterans. I had to find a Republican colleague with whom I could work on that, or we just weren't going to get it passed. And I feared my constituents enough to know that if I came back and blamed the failure to make progress on Republicans, they would laugh or vote me out of office, right? And so sitting down with a colleague with whom I don't agree on everything, and didn't even agree on every detail of this bill, and getting to consensus and then compromise, which is a four-letter word right now, especially in the Capitol, that was necessary to get it passed and get it signed into law by Donald Trump. Again, someone with whom I agree on almost nothing. But you ask a larger question. This president, I mentioned some of the horrific things that he has said. The invitation to open hatred and violence, hate crimes on the rise, every single one of the last 3 years. You don't put kids in cages unless you've been given permission by the president who has dehumanized those kids. That's how you can rationalize it. Or that's the only way I can think you can rationalize it. And then there's this. As a candidate, he invited the participation of a foreign government. Didn't do it secretly, did it out in the open. As president, openly sought to obstruct the investigation into the invasion of our democracy in 2016. Fired the principal investigator, James Comey, director of the FBI. Tweeted, again in broad daylight. It's kind of like that Goebbels line, the bigger the lie, right? In broad daylight to his attorney general saying to stop the Russia investigation. Discloses details of it to the Russian government, after the Mueller report is produced, calls Vladimir Putin and calls the whole deal a hoax, thereby giving him the green light to further involve himself in this country, and then inexplicably tells George Stephanopoulos that if offered dirt on a competitor by a foreign government, that he would accept it. If we accept that, then we have set the precedent that some are really above the law. And we will have forever lost the precedent that we are a nation of laws and not men. On the 4th of July, we got to go to this baseball game in Des Moines, and I got to go with my family. And before the game started, there was a naturalization ceremony. And what struck me, and I've been to these before, but I had forgotten this part of the oath that they're taking. They swear an oath not to this country, and not to any single one of us, but to the Constitution and to the laws of the United States of America. My concern is not only with this president, and not only with Republicans who fail to stand up and speak out against and put this country above their party or their election prospects or any polling that we shouldn't be caring about at this point, but just all of us, Democrats included, who won't make sure that we have rule of law in this country again. It's only then that I think you have honest brokers, people of good conscience and good faith with whom you can work and get these things done, everything that we're talking about right now. One of the best ways to address this, in my opinion, is to support great candidates for office, to ask them these questions, see where they land on it, and then make sure that they're in office so that they can hold those in power accountable, and so that they can become the new majority with whom we can work on these important issues. So, thanks for asking the question. Yes, go ahead.
Do you have a plan for combating information manipulation, both as candidate and as president?
Question is, do we have a plan to combat the manipulation of information, both as a candidate and as President of the United States? Yes. Part of it is to be as transparent as possible. So, so much of what we do, what I say, the questions I answer is live streamed, so everyone gets the same information. There's no question about what the facts are. Trying to be as transparent as possible about our positions, but also taking measures to safeguard the data and communications and information of this campaign. That's what we're doing on a personal level on the campaign. As president, I think we have to ask, and not just ask, but demand through executive action and law, more of the technology companies and the social media companies, where we have really become the products and our data, our pictures, our information. There was this almost horrifying article today about the rise of facial recognition based on all the photos that we've submitted on Tinder, on present company excluded. Even on all these social media sites that has been used against us or used by foreign powers, as we saw the Russian government do for a bargain price, be able to pit ourselves against ourselves in the last election. And they're doing it in this one, and they're not just doing it in America. They are attacking the Western democracies right now, almost with complete impunity. So ensuring that we do more to safeguard our information, and then guaranteeing that any foreign power understands that there will be very real consequences, unlike what we've seen in this administration, for manipulating our elections, our public opinion, this great democracy that has withstood the last 243 years and test of time, but unclear if we're going to make it through again unless we take these measures. Yeah, sir. Yeah.
I just had a question concerning the role of public education. Our current administration and Secretary DeVos are undermining public education. I'm an 8th grade social studies teacher.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to hear your policy to kind of fully or help fund us so we're not having budget cuts in school, have paper go around, et cetera, in our current plan.
Thanks for asking, and thanks for your public service. For those who didn't hear the question, it's about public education. Gentleman introduced himself as an 8th grade social studies teacher. Talked about just having the resources to make sure that kids can learn in the classroom. And I don't know what it's like in New Hampshire. In Texas, the teacher on average, the educator on average, spends between $800 to $1,000 out of his or her own pocket for decorations, for school supplies for the kid who forgot to bring them or just doesn't have the money to purchase them. Yeah. But also we are learning for that child who's on free and reduced breakfast and lunch, a warm meal that she cannot expect at home. That teacher out of his own pocket is purchasing that. The kid who shows up in the same pair of jeans and t-shirt Monday through Thursday, we're hearing stories from teachers who buy that kid a new set of clothes, understanding that his ability to learn is tied to his sense of self-worth, his dignity, and they're going to make sure that they connect him with that dignity so that he can learn. How do we meet the challenge that those teachers now in this country are on average in Texas working 2 or 3 jobs, have student loan debts, $30, $40, $50, $60,000. They borrowed for the privilege of educating our kids and sacrificing in this role of public service. Here's some investments that we can make. Under my administration, we will fully fund the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. For those special education teachers, just as an example, that means the resources that they need in the classroom, the additional instructors to make sure that they're delivering world-class education, and it frees local school districts to make additional investment in educator pay so that you don't have to work that second or third job, or so that you don't leave the profession altogether. We're also going to set up a permanent education fund of $500 billion, which will in part be invested in making sure that we address the disparity in white majority and minority majority school districts, which are underfunded to the tune of $23 billion a year. Some people have said, and who am I to argue this, that segregation de facto in this country in public education is worse today than it was in 1954, the year of Brown versus Board of Education. But we've got to go beyond equality in funding to actual equity in education. That means that we try to find, hire, and retain teachers who look like the students in front of them. We know that we have a disparity in discipline where a child who's 5 years old in a kindergarten classroom is 5 times as likely to be suspended or expelled if she or he is a child of color. That's setting up people to fail when they're at their most vulnerable moment in their lives. So making these investments, changing these policies, moving the first day of public education universally from kindergarten to pre-K, and then funding higher education going forward. And then lastly, for you and others who commit to public service, we will completely wipe clean any student loan debt so you can focus on those kids in front of you in the classroom. So, thanks for asking the question. Yes.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
As a member of Moms Demand Action, I'm sure you're aware of the organization.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So having 4 children, all of whom have been in school during a school shooting or just a random mall shooting or a movie shooting or a concert shooting, I think you know what my question is going to be, but in the state of New Hampshire, the laws are significantly different than a lot of states surrounding us. We are open carry, and I was wondering what you were going to do about the gun issues we're having all across this country and the weapons that are available that should only be used on war.
Right.
What is your plan?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for your advocacy and I bet. And yet, as we were saying earlier, it is only by forming that public pressure that you develop the political will to make any of these changes. Really, Moms Demand Action, the students who led the walkouts and the marches for our lives, they're the ones who deserve the credit. You're the one who deserves the credit for the fact that the House passed universal background checks. You will deserve the credit once we compel the Senate to follow suit and get the President to sign that into law. But you're doing it because you know that it saves lives. We'll see nearly 40,000 lives lost in this country this year due to gun violence. No other country comes close to this level of bloodshed. And for me, it forces the question, is there something wrong with us? Evil about us? Inherently violent about Americans? Or is this a human cause problem with a human solution, and we've just failed to bridge those two? And that's what I choose to believe. It sounds like that's what you choose to believe. And whether it's universal background checks that close every loophole. So the boyfriend loophole, which says if you don't have a legal relationship with somebody, then it's not material that you've beaten your boyfriend or your girlfriend when you try to purchase a gun. Close that loophole so that we know your history of violence and ensure that you cannot use that firearm against a loved one or yourself or anybody else. The Charleston loophole, which says that if it's taken too many days, we'll just forego the background check and you can have the gun. That's nuts,
crazy.
That we do that in this country. So everybody has a background check before they can purchase and use a firearm. You made a really great point. So weapons of war were designed, engineered, and then sold to the United States military for the express purpose of killing people as effectively, as efficiently as possible. And this is something that I had a lot of conversations about in the state of Texas, as you can imagine. And folks would say, well, what's wrong with me being able to have an AR-15? First thing I'd say is, if you have an AR-15, keep the AR-15, use it responsibly. I do not want to take your gun. But here's the thing. When I talk to emergency room doctors who've treated gunshot wounds, they tell me that when they're treating somebody who's been shot by a handgun, if that bullet did not hit a major artery or your heart and we get to you in time, we can save your life. But an AR-15, high velocity, high impact round, produces a hole the size of an orange out your back. It shreds everything inside. You are dead because that's exactly what it was designed to do. Keep that on the battlefield. Don't sell any more into our country, into our communities. They end up in our churches, in our synagogues, in our schools, in our public life. They take the lives of our fellow Americans. Red flag laws, when someone exhibits behavior that tells us that they may be a danger to themselves or someone else in their life or your life or my life, let's stop them before it's too late. All of these are common sense. All of these we talked about in every one of the 254 counties of Texas, and we learned that Republicans, Democrats, independents, gun owners, and non-gun owners alike see this. What then explains the fact that we failed to make progress? It's because the NRA, up until Moms Demand and some of the advocacy groups that have developed over the last 10 years, has been able to call the tune with members of Congress, purchase their complicity and their silence. The law that says that the Centers for Disease Control cannot even study gun violence, lest we learn the truth and the facts, and that compels us to act. It would be like 50 years ago if there was a law that said the Surgeon General cannot study the link between cigarette smoke and lung cancer in this country. We got to make sure that we're doing what's great for people, not what's great for corporations, special interests, polls, even the next election. So this campaign that takes no PAC money is all about listening to and following the lead of people like you, is going to produce the leadership, I hope, that will allow us to make these changes that we need. It'll save lives. Thank you for asking. Okay, time for a couple more questions.
I had a question about the current situation involving Squad of 4 in the House and Nancy and the moderates. And I noticed that a lot of the candidates are staying clear of this issue, yet I believe it's a key issue for getting maybe not getting elected in the primary, but the general election. And I want to know how you appeal to both sides of that spectrum, and how we can make peace and less and beat Trump.
Yeah.
That's my question. That's a good question. I'm trying to ask.
So, for those who did not hear, how do we address the fact that there is faction and some level of division, it appears, within the Democratic caucus in the House, which may speak to division within the Democratic electorate more broadly, nationally? I'll begin by telling you that I'm really grateful that I have the endorsement of colleagues with whom I used to work in the House who bridge those divisions. So from the Progressive Caucus to the New Democratic Caucus to the Blue Dog Caucus. So from the most progressive to the most conservative. I'm very grateful to have my fellow Democrats endorse this campaign. I think our party, in our country, the world's greatest democracy, is big enough to have these debates and these conversations, to have this robust discussion, and then come to what I hope ultimately is a consensus vision for our party and for the country. So this recent debate about how to address funding at the border for those kids who are toddlers without diapers, soiling themselves in the floor on which they're going to sleep that night. How do we make sure we get them the resources, the humanitarian care, but also ensure that there is oversight and accountability for those who are responsible for the fact that 6 kids over the last year have died within CBP care? I'm grateful that they had the conversation. Grateful for Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and for my hometown Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, who made that bill better than otherwise would have been, but also grateful for Nancy Pelosi, who has what must be among the hardest jobs on the face of the planet today, to make sure that in the majority that we produce these victories and these results that the country is counting on. And I'll point to one that just occurred yesterday that I think is encouraging. So we're 18 years in war in Afghanistan, 28 years at war in Iraq. We're in Somalia and Yemen, in Libya as well, Syria tonight too. President Trump has threatened to take us into war in Iran. Nancy Pelosi, that Democratic caucus, and also working with Republicans, passed something in the House yesterday that would prevent President Trump from taking this country into yet another Middle East war in Iran unless he comes back to Congress, our representatives, to get our permission, ensure that we follow Article 1 of the Constitution. So I mentioned the gun safety legislation that has passed, H.R. 1 that ensures that our democracy is responding to people and not PACs and corporations. Right. This latest measure to stop us from going into another war. I understand that debate, those divisions are there, but I also want to call our attention to that progress that is taking place. And let's just make sure that when that debate happens, that we have it in good faith, listen to one another, and then at the end of the day, stay focused on what I'm focused on, what you're focused on. Whether I'm the nominee or someone else is, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that Donald Trump does not have a second term in We'll take one more at the very back.
Kind of to extend on that, we need to bring the Democratic Party together, but the people that currently support Donald Trump, if you were the nominee, how do you intend to reach out to them? To argue that it's beyond a party, it's a cult of personality now?
Yeah.
How would you appeal to that group and try to drive a broad coalition of Americans, not of Democrats?
Yeah. Great question. I mentioned earlier that in our campaign for the United States Senate, we went to every single one of the 254 counties of Texas. And I went to the reddest counties, not in our state, but on planet Earth. King County, county seat Guthrie, voted for Donald Trump 96% in the 2016 election. But to the spirit of your question, I firmly believe they're every bit as deserving of being heard, of being respected, of being listened to, fought for, represented, and served. And so I showed up because there's no way for me to deliver for them unless I've first had a chance to meet them. One of the things that I learned, and I know this is an issue that the senator has been working on, they have a water system that is unsafe to drink from. And I've been hearing concerns about PFAS here in New Hampshire. Those are issues that connect these two communities, that connect Denmark, South Carolina, where you cannot drink out of the water system, that connects Flint, Michigan, that connects the Central Valley of California. We have something in common there. By showing up, learning about that problem there, hearing about the solutions that community has come up with, I don't know, maybe we won 1 or 2 votes in that last election. But more importantly, maybe we built a little bit of goodwill that we can use once we are in office to make sure that we have the support to deliver on the solutions for water quality or combating climate change that is affecting these smaller and sometimes rural and red and Trump country communities more than other places in this country. But if we write people off, I guarantee you we have no chance with them. If we take them for granted, it's never going to happen. I'll close with one story that was really powerful for me as we were traveling Texas. We went to this place called Archer City, which if you've read Lonesome Dove or The Last Picture Show or know who Larry McMurtry is, that's where he's from. And he's got a bookstore there as well. This is a place so red that the Democrats long ago, decades ago, stopped showing up. So red, Democrats stopped showing up so Republicans don't have to. They don't have to hold meetings like these. The general election in November is already spoken for. So those folks effectively, functionally, are not represented or participating in our democracy. We showed up to Archer City, and as we're going into Mern's Cafe to have this town hall meeting with the 12 folks who've shown up, 8 more who are innocently having breakfast there. This guy stops me as I'm walking in, and he says, I want to show you something. And he has a manila envelope, and out of it he pulls a black and white photo. And he says, that guy third from the left is my dad. The year is 1948. The person that he's talking to is Congressman Lyndon Baines Johnson, who is running for the U.S. Senate. LBJ had dropped out of the sky in a helicopter, landed on the courthouse lawn of the Archer County Courthouse, walked over to the American Legion Hall, and just listened to this guy's dad and others before he asked for their vote. He wanted to make sure he understood them so that he could serve them. And this guy says, my dad lived in Archer County his entire life. I've lived in Archer County my entire life. You were the first Senate candidate from either party to show up in the last 70 years. At the end of the day in Texas, we won more votes than any Democrat in the history of the state. We won independence. 500,000 Republicans voted for a Republican for governor, voted for us, despite or maybe because of our progressive agenda that we brought to every single county in that state. That's what I think it will take to defeat Donald Trump. That's what I think it will take, to your question, to bring this very divided, highly polarized country back together again. Thanks for the question. Thank you for hosting us today. Thank you all for coming out. Very, very